Welcome everyone to our webinar on a founder's guide to selling your shares. My name's David Kerr and I'm joined with my colleague Miles Guggenheimer. We're both senior lawyers here in LegalVision's capital raising corporate transaction team. Before we begin, there's a couple of housekeeping items we wanted to walk through. At the end of this webinar, you'll be emailed the slides and the recording. You'll also be eligible for a free consult at the end of this webinar. In order to take advantage of that free consult, you'll need to fill out your contact details into the survey that appears at the end of this webinar. You will also have an opportunity to be answering some questions at the end, so please submit those questions through the chat function in the webinar. So, as I said, the complimentary consultation is through the chat function of the webinar. So once you submit the survey and you leave your details, you'll be able to take advantage of that consultation. In today's webinar, we're going to tackle a number of issues or a number of hurdles that founders need to jump through in order to be able to sell their shares. Not everyone will apply to every founder. All circumstances are different, but we're going to cover when founders sell their shares and the types of events that will result in a share sale, when it can be sold to a third party, when it can't, any restrictions on selling shares such as share vesting, lockup periods, how a preemptive rights process works, what co-sale rights are if you haven't heard of them and how they affect your ability to sell shares. We'll also briefly touch on share valuations and raise some tax implications that you'd need to consider and potentially get additional advice on, and then we'll have an opportunity at the end to answer some of the questions that you submit. So that's enough for me for now, and I'll hand over to Miles and he will walk through when founders sell their shares.
Great, thanks so much, David. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking through when do founders sell their shares. The three key concepts in terms of when a share sale for founders does occur is the first one is an exit event. So that's when you're selling your whole company as part of an acquisition. That's very much a topic within itself, but just be conscious that that's one example of when you can sell your shares. The second one is a capital raise. So often later stage companies where they're conducting a capital raise, founders will have an opportunity to sell a portion of their shares to investors as part of that capital raise. That's what we call a secondary sale. The third concept is just a private sale. So potentially you're approached by someone, they love your business, they want to buy some of your shares and you can sell some of your shares to that third party as part of a private sale. So on to the next slide, we'll jump through kind of the key things to look out for when you're selling your shares to a third party. The first concept is share vesting. Now this is very standard in a lot of shareholders agreements, especially for startup companies. The next concept is founder lockups. This is a term that's often included by investors when negotiating investing into a company. The third concept is preemptive rights. Once again, a very common concept in shareholders agreements. And the fourth concept is co-sale rights, which David will jump into a bit more later on. So onto the first concept in some more detail, share vesting on the next slide. So this is a really common mechanism and provision in shareholders agreements. The way that share vesting is typically used is that it's a way of founders earning their shares. So for example, when you get together with a bunch of founders or an investor wants to invest into your company, they often attach vesting to your shares. Typically, you cannot sell your shares if they're unvested. So you have to wait until your shares are vested until you can sell them. A really common vesting mechanism is a 4-year vesting period with a 1-year cliff. What this means is that for the first year, you can't sell any of your shares until you pass the 1-year cliff, and then typically 25% each year after that over the 4 years until all the shares are vested, you can sell them. So if you're entering into a shareholders agreement, if you're discussing with your founders vesting mechanisms, always look towards the future and think about when do I want to sell my shares and will they be vested at that point in time. So on to the next slide now. The next concept we're going to go through now is what's called founder lockups. Now, similar to vesting, although a bit more restrictive in terms of how it works. When an investor looks to invest in a company, they want to make sure that they're really investing in you as the founder moving forwards, or investing in the founder to make sure that the value in the company is there and the really talented person who runs the company stays with the company. A way of ensuring that you stay with the company is that they lock up your shares in what's called a founder lockup provision. This is typically dealt with under the shareholders deed and is often included by investors when they invest in companies through a capital raising process. A really important thing for founders to consider with lockups is that if it's really important for the investor to include this provision in the shareholders deed, potentially you can negotiate that a small percentage of your shares can be sold outside of lockup, allowing you to sell some shares down the line if you need that capital, or if you want to sell some shares to take some profit from the business. So before agreeing to any lockups, make sure you have a chat to us about it first, or before you sign any term sheets, keep an eye out for founder lockup provisions if you want to sell your shares in the near future. On to the next slide. Yeah, so preemptive rights, really common in most shareholders agreements, and something that is often overlooked when people are looking to sell shares. So something to consider when with regards to preemptive rights is that before you offer your shares to a third party, you'll often have to give the opportunity to buy those shares to the other shareholders in the company first. The typical process is approximately a 10-day business period where you offer the shares to the current shareholders and they can choose to take up that offer. But you can also just request that the shareholders waive that right over a shorter period of time. So this is a really fundamental concept to understand when selling shares, and it's really important that before you make any offers to anyone to buy the shares, that you offer those shares to the current shareholders if there are preemptive rights in the current shareholders agreement. So that's all for me for now. On to David to run through co-sale rights.
Thanks very much, Miles. As Miles said, we'll start off with co-sale rights. I think one of the important things to learn as a founder is there are usually a number of steps that you have to go through, a number of items that you need to satisfy before you can make a decision on selling your shares and finding out how many shares you can sell. So once you have had a look that your shares are vested and you know how many shares are vested, you have then checked you're not in a founder lockup period, or there's an exemption for a portion of your shares, and you know how many you can sell. You've then offered them to existing shareholders who didn't take them up. You found a third-party buyer. Another right that's often negotiated by investors, usually venture capital funds, are the most common sort of investors that negotiate this right, is the co-sale right. What it means is because the venture capital fund or the investor has come in and they've invested in the founder and the founder's vision, they say, we will let you sell some shares, but we will only let you sell some shares if we can sell the same amount of shares as you. So if you're looking to sell 5% of your shares, then they will sell 5% of their shares too. So what that means is if the purchaser only has a set budget, which is usually the case with the purchaser, the situation you might be in is you won't be able to take up all of that budget, because 10% of your shares and 10% of the investor shares, that money will need to be spread across the two classes of shares. So it just needs to take into account that you're not going to necessarily be prevented, but if you're making some financial decisions about how many shares you want to sell and what price you're selling them at, you need to take into account the co-sale rights, because they can have an impact on the commercial outcomes of the share sale and the reason that you're doing it in the first place. So if we head over to the next slide, another really important thing to consider, and this will really be something that you take into account when you're placing a value on your shares, is often founders and investors have different categories of shares. When you start up a company, you usually take an ordinary share class. You may or may not have put any capital into the company, but you normally have the rights that normally attach to shares, right to participate in profits, rights to vote, all the standard rights. When investors come on board, they usually ask for preference shares, and the reason is they're injecting capital into the company, so they usually ask for some preferential rights. One of them being liquidation preferences, which means if there was an exit event, which is one of the times that you would sell your shares, if the price that you're selling the entire company for isn't enough for everyone to get their money back, then investors get their money back before anyone else can participate. Now, because of those preferential rights, sometimes if you are selling down as part of a capital raise and you're selling to an investor might say, we don't want ordinary shares. We don't like ordinary shares. It doesn't give us our right to get our money back. It doesn't give us any dilution rights. So the only condition we will buy your shares are on the condition that you convert those shares into preference shares. So that's something that's sometimes a requirement of the sale, and that is another regulatory process that you have to go through. So there is a mechanism allowed under the corporations legislation and constitution that will set out how you can change your ordinary shares into your preference shares on the sale event, and then you update ASIC accordingly, like all other share issues. If we head over to the next slide, and I briefly touched on this point, once you've found out all the regulatory hurdles that you need to go through and the approval process and how much and who and what and when you can sell your shares, the fundamental question is, what are you selling your shares for? What are they worth? The first situation we spoke about, the exit event, usually that exit event places a price on the entire company. So that's usually something that either the founders will negotiate with the purchaser of the company. Sometimes investors will have a say in that. Usually when you're thinking about negotiating your shareholders agreement, sometimes you want to put provisions in your shareholders agreement that says if you get a guaranteed multiple of return for investors, then they don't get to block an exit. So it's really important that before you get to your shareholders agreement and negotiating that, you set yourself up to be in the best possible place to make an exit decision when you're ready. But exit negotiations are usually on multiples of EBITDA or some other valuation technique. The other situation that Miles spoke about earlier, the secondary sale, which is when you're selling down as part of a capital raise round. Often in that situation, the default position is to say, well, if we're valuing the company on the capital raise, then my shares must be worth the value that everyone's paying to invest. So you tie the share price to the capital raise issue price of new shares, remembering that with a capital raise, you issue new shares and the company takes money. With a share sale, you transfer your shares to somebody else and you keep the money. So they are quite different, but the price of the shares shouldn't change. The only real exception to that is what we spoke about before, being the class of the shares. It's often thought that because of those preferential rights that preference shares have, then the preference share has a little higher value than the ordinary share. So if you're not converting your shares into preference shares as part of a round, there is sometimes a belief that your shares might be worth somewhat some amount less than the preference shares in that round. So the valuation could differ slightly compared to the round price. If it's a private sale and it's not tied to a round, then you need to go through valuation method, whether that's through negotiating a price or getting an independent party to provide a valuation report and official valuation done. Valuations, the reason why they are important, and we'll talk about it on the next slide, is for two things. You want to make sure you're getting the best value for yourself, but valuation of shares also has tax implications. So if we head over to the next slide, we'll discuss very briefly and more so for your own personal awareness how tax applies to the selling of shares. So it's important to remember that when you do sell shares or you think about selling shares, it is important that you speak to your tax advisors or your accountants to see what the financial impacts will be on you, depending on how you hold your shares and depending on the price you paid for your shares or how you received your shares, how long you've held them. There's a number of items that need to be taken into account. One of the things that is a risk that a lot of people aren't aware of is when you're negotiating a price for a share and it's a negotiation between two parties. In a very specific situation where for some reason you're selling your shares below the the market value of the company, there is a risk, or there is a mechanism under tax law, remembering that corporate laws and the actual selling of shares sometimes are very different to the way that the tax laws treat a share sale. Under those tax laws, there is a situation where your share sale could be deemed to have had happened for a different price. So the tax legislation has a concept which is called a fair market value substitution. If you sell your shares below fair market value, sometimes from a tax perspective, the tax payable could be on the full fair market value of those shares, meaning you pay tax on money that you never receive. So it is really important not to just go away and agree to a share price and sign up to sell some shares without taking that tax advice, because you want to know what the tax consequences are going to be moving forward, as the usual reason why we're selling shares is to cash in and have some money to spend to do other things with. And if we end up with a larger tax bill than expected, maybe we don't have so much money left over to do what we need to do. So that really concludes the main, the first section of our webinar on the content. It is really important to remember and probably take away the key issues from this webinar, which are that there is different types of exit events: a full sale of the company, whether you're exiting as part of a capital raise or you're just making a private sale. Remember to look into your shareholders agreement before thinking about selling shares, or alternatively, if you are early stage and you're still negotiating a shareholders agreement, think about share vesting, think about founder lockups, think about how long you need to have the preemptive right process open. Think about what's a fair amount you could be accepted before co-sale rights or lockups come into play, because there may be a situation where you do need to sell down shares. Now, your need to sell down shares might be based on your personal financial circumstances. Often investors sort of say, well, if founders are taking below market salary wages, then sometimes it's fair for them to cash in on some of their equity and get it paid in another way. Think about the share class conversions and what rights attached to the different classes of shares that you have given away, or if you haven't given away any different types of preferential shares, think about what the preference rights you are giving away, because they will always come back in a later stage when you do want to exit to hopefully not regret, but be something that can disadvantage you. And then, yeah, once you've worked through what those scenarios would be, it's the famous words of all corporate lawyers: take tax advice and make sure you know what you're getting yourself into before you sign away some of your shares. So one of the guides that we have available and is attached to this webinar is our Founder's Guide to Selling Your Shares. It's a really useful guide which talks you through the share sale prices. It also goes through a little bit more detail of an entire exit event and a full share sale of the company, so it can be a really useful resource. One of the other items that can be really useful for you as a business owner is one of our upcoming webinars, which is protecting your employees' mental health and looking at some of the new obligations under work health and safety laws. So that one's on Thursday, the 9th of March at 11 a.m. on East Coast time. So if you're interested in that and you want to take out some nice gems from that webinar, please register. We're going to now answer your questions, so feel free to add those through the chat function of this webinar. I'll hand back over to Miles and he can talk you through some of our membership options and what.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. So in terms of LegalVision's membership is a cost-effective alternative to the expensive hourly rates you experience at our law firms. For an affordable monthly fee, you receive cost certainty and all-inclusive legal services, including unlimited doc review, including drafting, amending and reviewing business contracts, commercial leases. It includes unlimited advice consultations with our team of over 100+ specialist lawyers, including things like business structuring, employment disputes, and regulatory advice. We also have unlimited domestic trademark registrations as part of the membership. So LegalVision's membership is like having your own in-house counsel. We'll take care of all the business as usual legal work so you can focus on running your business. And if you are an in-house legal counsel, our membership is a cost-effective solution for outsourcing any additional legal work. To learn more about how our membership can help you, request a free consultation with a survey appears at the end of this webinar. I think we've got some great questions coming through now, so I might just jump straight into one that's come through that I like the look of. Yeah, great. So the first question we have here is, I'm going through a fundraise at the moment. I'd like to know what the key things are I should be paying attention to in the shareholders agreement to allow for a private or public sale down the track. Now, this is a really great way for us to overview the slides we've just been through before. As discussed, have a look at the shareholders agreement first and have a look at the concepts that we discussed, things like share vesting. Are you subject to vesting at the moment? Can you sell your shares or are they still unvested? Things like founder lockups. Are your shares currently subject to a founder lockup? Once those are the kind of critical things to consider that will actually prevent you from selling your shares. If you can sell your shares, if they're vested and they're not subject to a lockup, the next step is thinking about things like preemptive rights. So great, I have a third party coming and want to buy the shares, but I need to first potentially offer those shares to the current shareholders in the company. And secondly, are there any co-sale rights attached? So will there be anyone also joining me as part of the sale? So they're kind of the critical fundamental things to look at in the shareholders agreement before selling the shares as part of the raise. In terms of looking forward, or if anyone is in the process of raising capital, hasn't signed a term sheet yet, always think about things like, for example, as I mentioned before, if there is a founder lockup and the investor is adamant that that has to be part of the raise to stop you selling your shares, you can always negotiate that you want to be able to sell, for example, 10% of your shares over the next 2 years to allow yourself to cash in on a few of those shares if you need to. That's always some good advice to take before agreeing to having your shares locked up for multiple years, because as David says, you never know what's going to happen and you want to have the ability to sell some shares if you have to. So they're really some of the key considerations to think about when looking forward. When signing a term sheet or raising capital, think about in the future, will I need to sell shares? What if something goes wrong and I need to sell some of the shares quickly to get some cash? Always make sure there are mechanisms built into the document to allow for situations like that. I'll throw to David now. Is there any questions you'd like to look at, David?
Yeah, look, Miles, really good summary on that last question. There's another question that came through here, which says, we've been in business for 21 plus years, have 2 directors owning 50% shares each. One of the directors will retire first. How do we handle this situation? So one of the concepts of this talk is how a founder or a business partner or one of the shareholders sell their shares, and one option is the remaining director owner can buy out the other person, going through the items that we've discussed. The other option available to companies, which wasn't the contents of this presentation, but it is an option available to companies, which is called a share buyback. So instead of a shareholder buying shares from another shareholder, there is a situation where the company can actually purchase the shares, so use the company's funds to buy out the other partner. Obviously, as always, that's another one that needs tax advice, because the treatment for a share buyback is sometimes different for the treatment of a share transfer, and whether it's income tax or whether it's CGT tax or what tax might apply can always change. So in that sort of situation, sometimes the best path forward will really be governed by which one has the most favourable tax implications. There's a few more questions floating through here, Miles.
Yeah. I might just jump into one. I like to look at this one. So is it possible or legal to sell shares to other founders at the original purchasing price, even if the company valuation or current share price is much higher today? This is a great point, and yeah, it's a good question, because while you might be thinking that you're helping out other founders, there's some really important things to consider before agreeing to selling those shares to them. So from a corporate perspective, it's obviously fine to sell those shares at a discounted price to the other founders. The first thing to consider though is there preemptive rights in the shareholders agreement. So you might think that you can sell the shares to the founder, come up with an offer for an extremely discounted price, and then the other shareholders in the company take up their pro rata allocation of that super discounted price, and then you end up giving away a bunch of shares to people you weren't intending to, or you're kind of forced to go through with a sale to other people that you didn't want to, or pull out of the sale altogether. So that's one of the first things to consider. The second thing to consider when selling shares is we always strongly recommend you get some tax advice around that, as David touched on, and he gave some really good insight into from a tax perspective. But there could also be an implication where you're selling the shares at a discount price, but you have to pay the market value of tax on those when you sell them. So as always, when conducting a sale, make sure you get tax advice, especially if you're selling the shares at a discount to the third party as well. Any more questions you'd like to look at, David?
Yeah, another one just came through here, which is quite a common question, a really good one, is what considerations do you have with key new team members joining and earning sweat equity, usually in lieu of accepting below market salary? So with team members that come on, not so much a share sale here or a capital raise, but one thing that's usually taken up by companies is what's called an employee share option plan. So with key hires, where it is hard as a startup company to be able to afford competitive market salaries, a way that you can incentivize employees is by giving them some equity in the company. The most common way to do that is, as I said, the employee share option plan, and the reason being is there is much more favourable tax treatment of that. You can give the exercise price on those options quite low, but with those with giving away sweat equity to staff in terms of options, or even if you go down the share path, it is important that you do consider vesting for those staff as well. It's just a way that investors want founders' shares to vest, to incentivize them to be here for the long term. You also want to do that with your staff. So employee share option plans is something here at LegalVision we specialize in. It's something that's covered in your memberships. So if anyone has any ESOP queries as well, then feel free to reach out after the session when you sign up for your complimentary webinar.
I've just seen another great one come through, David. So, and very good practical example. So, do you ever see investors exercise preemptive rights in practice? Working in the cap raising team, we see this all the time. And just to give some kind of context in terms of how preemptive rights work, effectively the preemptive rights are allowing the shareholder to maintain their shareholding percentage moving forwards in the company. So a lot of the time we'll do a seed round, a VC will come in, they'll invest, they'll want to, at a minimum, maintain that percentage shareholding to the future. The reason for this might be something like there's a control mechanism triggered by owning X percentage of shares. So, for example, maybe only key decisions in the company can be made by shareholders holding 75% of the shares in the company. If a VC holds 30% of shares in the company, they want to maintain that position because effectively they will have a veto right then to stop decisions being made in the company by maintaining 30% of the company. But the way they can do this is by exercising their preemptive rights every time there's a capital raise to make sure they take up more and more shares each raise. So that's something to be really conscious of as well, is that once you get someone on your cap table and there is a mechanism like preemptive rights in the shareholders agreement, that will allow that entity or that individual to maintain their shareholding and that percentage of shareholding in the company moving forwards, and potentially maintain control of the company moving forwards as well. So that's a really good question, and it does come up a fair bit with capital raising and share sales as well.
Yeah, very good. Somebody's brought through here a bit of a follow-on question to some of the vesting conversations that we've been having. The question is, with a vesting strategy for staff, and after a certain period of time, after a year, they can buy their share, what happens in the event that somebody leaves the companies? Do they get to keep the shares they bought? So we didn't go into a huge amount of details of the specifics of share vesting, but it's a good opportunity now just to sort of flesh out how vesting works. So vesting is time-based, and once a share is vested, you do have a right to sell it, and sometimes you don't have a right to sell an unvested shares, but there are further consequences of vesting that aren't tied to share sales, and that is usually what happens if you leave the company during the vested period. So founders and employees are often in similar situations. If you leave the company before vesting, you usually lose your unvested shares, so the company takes them back for usually nominal money, $1, maybe maybe something a little bit higher, but it's quite common, $1, it's just nominal. And then your vested shares are one of the more negotiated terms. So what happens to your shares if they're vested really is a deal by deal consideration that you need to have. Founders sometimes say, well, I want to be able to keep my shares, I haven't done anything wrong, provided I'm a good leaver. If you're a bad leaver, then sometimes the way your vested shares are treated. The same sort of philosophy is usually founders take to their employees. If you have vested shares as an employee, sometimes you can be allowed to keep them, or alternatively, if you're a good leaver, the company can buy back those options at a fair market value price. Or if you're a bad leaver, then sometimes the company can either take back the shares or purchase those shares at some sort of discount to fair market value, which is usually relative to the wrongdoing that employee had. So whilst we've covered a vast range of topics, each one of those topics is quite considered, and they are often negotiated for the finer details. So really good question, and it is something to take in mind with everything we've covered here today, that it's not just the share sale element where these terms come into play, but there's many other consequences of these terms.
All right. Just having a look through the questions now. Were there any more that jumped out at you, David, that you'd like to jump into, or?
Just going through here. There's one here which is a concept, really good question that we didn't cover, which is drag along and tag along rights, and how a co-sale right will work in with those drag and tag rights. So just quickly, we'll summarize drag along and tag along rights so that we can answer this question properly. A drag along right effectively gives a majority of shareholders the right to force a sale of the company. So as a founder, it can sometimes be hard to find somebody who's willing to purchase a small portion of shares. Sometimes it's easier to find somebody who's willing to buy the whole company. Now, as we said, when you're negotiating your shareholders agreement, you want to make sure as a founder that you can control that conversation as best as possible. So one of the ways that you can help control that conversation is to make sure that you negotiate a drag along right. Now, a drag along right will usually say, for example, 75% of the shareholders, if they agree, can force the remaining 25% to accept a purchase of the whole company and to also sell their shares. Now, some of the things that go into a drag along right is things like a minimum price paid. Investors might say you can only do that so long as we get a return on our investment, or you can only do that with our approval. So there might be a specific investor or a specific class of investor that can veto a drag along right. But it is a really important right to help you exit a company. The tag along right is sort of the flip side protection, the concession that a founder makes to have the opportunity to force a sale. And the tag along right is somewhat similar to a co-sale right, though the tag along right says if people selling a certain percentage of shares decide to leave the company, and it's usually tied to a percentage relevant to the founder's holding, so it's usually 40 or 50%, because founders are usually majority shareholders up until later stages. If you decide to exit the company, then any shareholder, not just those with a co-sale right, could say, well, you can only exit if you bring us along with you, which could result then in a situation where somebody is willing only to buy your portion, but they don't want to buy the whole company, and you can't sell because the remaining shareholders have tried to tag along with your sale, and they therefore block it because that person who was interested in buying a 40% stake doesn't want to buy 100% of the shares. So the tag along is similar to that co-sale, that people can come along for the founder's exit. I think a couple more.
Yeah, there's one more here that's a similar question to what we had before. So, am I legally allowed to sell founder shares at the purchasing price, e.g. 1 cent, to other founders in order to transfer ownership, even if capital is raised at a much higher price? So this, like we said, from a corporate perspective is fine. But once again, you need to be aware of the risks associated with that. So things like I said, things like preemptive rights, or someone else that you're not intending to transfer the shares to take up their pro rata allocation of those shares you're trying to transfer to another founder. Like we said, there's also potential adverse tax consequences. So you might be paying tax on the market value of those shares, even though you're transferring them for 1 cent, and there could be an adverse tax consequence for you. So always be really mindful that you might be trying to help out another founder in the group by transferring them some shares for ownership purpose, but that could have firstly adverse consequences with transferring shares to other shareholders for a massive discount because they take up their preemptive rights, or there could be adverse tax consequences. So always be aware of those issues when trying to transfer shares between founders.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Miles. I see a few more that are floating through that are starting to get well outside the realm of corporate law and business sales. Some really great tax questions, and we're getting pretty heavy on tax here. I think it's we are starting to come close to the end here. We won't delve too much into the taxation side of things, only because tax law is something that's outside of our realm, and also something that's usually done from a tax advisor as well as your accountant, because tax law applies generally, but it is, unlike other areas of law, very dependent on personal circumstances. So because it's very advisory in nature, the best person to help you with your tax advice and your tax questions really is your accountant as the first point of call, because they know the minutiae of your details, your personal circumstances. They can help you with the decision making, but then they can also give you the different options and the different ways that tax will be treated, and then you'll be able to do some calculations about which is the more favorable option. Just remembering that tax comes into play on buying and selling shares. It comes into play when shares are being issued. It all comes down to how many shares are being issued, what the company is worth, whether you're an employee or not an employee. Has a valuation been given that from an independent party that you can rely on? There really is a lot that goes into tax treatment. It would be a whole webinar on itself. So from a tax perspective, it really is important that you sit down with your accountant and your tax advisors, because that's never going to be a short conversation. There'll be lots of questions asked and lots of ifs and buts and whens, but the main takeaway really from our perspective is we see it all the time. Transaction documents have been signed, people have agreed to things, and then they go and seek advice afterwards, and they find out from their tax advisor that they now have some unforeseen consequences that they can't get out of because the agreement's already been signed. So the real takeaway here is, let's have these conversations before we sign documents, whether that's negotiating shareholders agreements or whether we're selling shares and taking tax advice, whatever it is. It's always great to take the advice before signing rather than after the fact. So I think, as I said sort of at the start of the webinar, that concludes the questions we had. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. There is a complimentary consultation that's available. The way that you can access that is a survey will pop up at the end of this. Shouldn't take you more than 30 seconds to fill in. You can leave your contact details there, and then you'll be able to book in that consultation through that process. So I hope everyone enjoyed that and had something to take away. Thanks very much, Miles. Wealth of wisdom. Really appreciate helping this one.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.